My name is Frank Nickel. I'm a volunteer here at the Red House, here to tell you a little bit about the early history of Cape Girardeau and the early history of the Red House. This is important to the Mississippi River Valley and certainly important to Cape Girardeau. So one of the things we want to talk about is, of course, who came to Cape Girardeau, who settled this region. And it's important to recognize that we were so much a part of Europe for a long, long time. From about the early 1700s to the 1800s, this was a part of Europe. And we're entangled with European affairs, and we're certainly compromised by all of that European history. From 1763 to 1803, this area was Spanish, and prior to that, it was French. From the very first settlement patterns to 1763, this was French. The problem with the French settlement was that they never could get enough people to come here to settle. So the Spanish attempted to come here, settle it, develop it, but they could never get enough people. It took Americans with a German background to come here, settle, become farmers, and stay in this region. So they built the population in the 19th and 20th century. In the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, there were very few people here. But they came from Europe, they came from poverty. They saw this continent discovered and settled in the early years as one of the great resources in world history and one of the great moments in world history. Here is the whole continent of North America waiting for settlers. And so in Europe, which was crowded, coming to America and getting virtually free land with no limitations, no control over this, was a great opportunity. And we had, by strange circumstance, the best topsoil in the world. So all of these Europeans who wanted land came to North America, which had the best land in the world, and populated it. This was a new frontier. It was a new land. And all of the people who settled here had to go through the process of adaptation to the climate. They thought the climate was just awful. It was too hot in the summertime, too cold in the winter. There were Native Americans here who didn't want them. There were snakes, there were mosquitoes, there were all kinds of insects, all kinds of diseases. People got sick, and they never understood the climate of America until the 19th and 20th centuries. So this is a tough place to come to. And those who survived became really tough and became assertive in their lifestyles. And they built a nation here with a whole different philosophy of life. And so this is America in the 1700s, 1800s, and it's going to be different for almost all of these people. And we have illustrations here that people can come in and take a look at. You can see the architecture of the French here, who were the first to settle. And they stayed in clusters. They stayed in communities that were French. They gave us an element of Frenchness that has stayed with us in some degree throughout our history. They built houses that were different. Americans have the tradition of building kind of Lincoln log homes, horizontal logs. But the French built log houses that were post in ground or post in sill. The logs were vertical instead of horizontal. So we have here illustrations of the evolution of French architecture in the Mississippi Valley. This is an unusual architecture. It is French in its full style, and it is a lesson of how the past passes to the present. So this is a very great historical lesson to come in and take a look at the evolution of the French homes and the French architecture. We also have here examples of the names of the people who came here. We have a list of settlers and professions. Once they got here, how did they make a living? And we have a list of all of the known professions, people who lived and worked here and shaped this land in its very early European ways. And they imposed that, of course, by aggression upon the Native Americans. They earned a living by every kind of profession known to mankind. Some of them are not known today, but they're merchants, certainly, they're physicians, there are nurses, there are carpenters, there are bricklayers, there are stonemasons, and there are even what are called wainwrights. They called them wainwrights, and that's a profession that was well known at one time in America. A wainwright is a wagon maker. There's a wheelwright, individuals who specialize just in making wheels to put on wagons. There also are what were called cordwainers. A cordwainer was a shoemaker who could make tough shoes out of the leather of animals. Cooper, for instance, a barrel maker. We still make barrels, but we don't make as many as we used to. So all of the professions that mankind used in Europe, they transferred to America. So they imposed the labor system upon the people who lived in the American colonies and on the American frontier. We're now looking at the panel that explains the history of slavery in Missouri. Slaves came to Cape Girardeau as people came to Cape Girardeau as early as 1619. One historian has said slavery is the one sin in the perfect land. We were the largest slave-holding nation in world history. And as a result, that built in a number of social and political economic problems. So when Americans came, they were going to be agricultural. And in agriculture, you need back-breaking labor. Consequently, slaves came in and intensive agricultural products like hemp, cotton, cattle. If you talk to the people at that time, they would have been great advocates of slavery because they saw it as a cheap supply of labor. And they believed in institution. Many of them came up with philosophies and explanations that they believed justified the institution of slavery. One of the stories we have is from a census that there were 111 slaves living in what is now Cape Girardeau in 1800. By 1803, there were 180. By 1860, there were over 2,000 slaves in what is now Cape Girardeau County. So slavery is an early 19th century institution. It grew fast. It made agriculture productive because you had cheap labor. And so we've been locked into slavery and all of its consequences ever since the first part of the 19th century. One of the great events in Cape Girardeau's history is the arrival of Lewis and Clark. They follow, of course, the Louisiana Purchase Treaty of 1803 that Thomas Jefferson signed, agreed to with the French. The French were not supposed to trade it or sell it to a third party according to the original agreement, but they did. In 1803, the French sold that to the United States for about 3 cents an acre. And it doubled the size of the United States in a single stroke. And it made America because it gave us all of the land west of the Mississippi to the watershed of the Great Stony Mountains. So it's the greatest land deal in world history. Jefferson had talked to his advisors, his council. He asked them, now what is it that we bought? And they all came back together and said, well, we're not quite sure. What do we have as restrictions on this? Well, we're not quite sure. So Jefferson, as president, called William Clark and asked him to put together a small contingent of men and take them to the West and see what it was that we bought, what it was that we had, what's out there, what can we do with it. And so William Clark invited some other people to go, and one of the people that Jefferson suggested was his cousin, Meriwether Lewis. And so Meriwether Lewis became a partner with William Clark. It was going to be the Clark expedition, but Jefferson wanted his cousin involved, so it became the Lewis and Clark expedition. And in 1803, he sent them west. They came down the Ohio River, they stopped in Louisville, got everything together in Louisville, came down the Ohio River, turned right at Cairo, Illinois, and headed north. And when they turned right on the Mississippi and encountered the current and the amount of water on the Mississippi, at that point, they realized they had to make some changes. The current was too strong, the water was too abundant. Consequently, they hired more people. They designated tasks. They selected hunters to go ashore and come up with some meat that they could eat. And they began scheduling work days and work tasks. And they moved north from Cape Girardeau up to the St. Louis area, and then in 1803 set out up the Missouri on one of the greatest adventures in world history. And they sent back fauna. They sent back plants and animals, maps, diagrams, illustrations, and by 1804 and 1805, everybody thought they were dead. They had never heard from them, except just a few items that had been sent back to them. So everyone assumed they were just gone, they were dead. But lo and behold, in 1806, here comes Lewis and Clark down the Missouri River, and they land in St. Louis to absolute amazement that they were still alive. And in this extensive venture west, Lewis and Clark stopped in Cape Girardeau. Small town, few hundred people living here, huddled on the banks of the Mississippi. And we have here illustrations, these are photocopies of pages of Lewis's journals, talking about what he found in Cape Girardeau in 1801 and 1802. And one of the most unusual stories is the fact that 4 of that contingent came back to Cape Girardeau. They had stopped here going north, saw this community, saw its settlement on the Mississippi. And when the whole voyage was completed, they came back to Cape Girardeau. And these 4 were George Drouillard, Alexander Willard, Reuben Field, and John Ordway. They each tell their stories, and we have a little history, short history, of each of these 4 men that came back from the Lewis and Clark venture to the Pacific and settled and lived the rest of their lives in Cape Girardeau. One cannot study Lewis and Clark and the American West without considering the Native American population that lived here. The land was theirs. This is where they had been for generation after generation. There was a cultural difference, certainly, between Europeans and Native Americans. And we had Native Americans in Cape Girardeau when Lewis and Clark came. And one of the passages here, they're describing that they had seen Native Americans in Jackson, Missouri. And they found several tribes. There are hundreds of different Indian or Native American tribes throughout America's West. They had developed in sort of isolated situations, connected by trade along rivers. The difficulty of transferring goods and of moving people across this continent was enormous because it's so big. Consequently, they depended upon rivers, and they had to develop various trade routes and trade connections to acquire what they needed to survive. And so here we have maps of and illustrations of some of the Native Americans who lived in this area, 17th century, 18th century. Some historians have argued that there were more Native Americans in the Mississippi Valley than any place else in North America. This was the center. They settled along the rivers. In St. Louis, there were more Native Americans per square mile than any place else in North America. This was their homeland. And here come the Americans acquiring with the Louisiana Purchase the acquisition of the whole Mississippi Valley. We had a cultural gap and we had to make a decision about what we would do toward Native Americans. Unfortunately, Native Americans did not adapt well and consequently European Americans drove them out. And so in Missouri, we drove all of the Native Americans out, either move out or be killed. We had no room for diversity, so we drove them out. We have no room for diversity in the early years of American history. We have an illustration here of the various tribes, and they're all tied to the rivers of the Mississippi Valley. This is the network where Native Americans thrived and survived. Important part of American history and important part of Missouri history for sure. One of the great stories of American history, seldom told, is the whole process of land distribution. Native Americans who had no procedural power within the European system occupying that land. How do you deal with Native Americans and their land claims? How do you take European land distribution systems and impose them upon the American continent? And in early America, if you ignore Native American claims to the land, as the Europeans generally did, we have 4 or 3 overlapping land distribution systems. We have Spanish, French, and English. We have, for instance, a map here of America and the land grants and the land parcels that Europeans imposed upon the American landscape. And in France, the land is distributed with riparian rights, meaning related to rivers. And so any landowner is supposed to have an outlet to water, an access to water. And so when you see settlers from France come to America, and they settle along the rivers, and then they farm inland. So they create what are called French long lots. French long lots. And if you fly over the Mississippi Valley, fly over the river, you can see the fence rows. You can see the hedgerows. You can see the green coloring that's shaded differently according to those long lots. So it's like a puzzle up and down the Mississippi. And we have on this map those long lots reproduced. The French live, work, and distribute land through long, thin stretches of land. Spain is a nation that has a few big rivers, but they don't have a lot of rivers. And people who live along rivers in Spain have great significance and prominence. When you look at the Spanish land grants, they are based upon family prominence. Can you get a land grant from the king or the government so that it's your land? And so they have all of these Spanish land grants shown on this map. The Spanish land grants are cockeyed. They're not square, they're not equal, they're odd size. And they are numbered. So every Spanish land grant has a number from the monarch, from the Spanish government. And what they would do to keep order is write in at the bottom of the land grant map the name of the owner. And he would be in full possession of that piece of land. And the river might go right across the land grant. They didn't account for rocks or big trees or rivers or lakes or ponds. You just had this land grant. And it's maybe 800 acres, maybe 1,000 acres, maybe 50 acres. Can be long, can be big, can be rectangular, can be square, any shape or size. And you put a number in it. And when you sell the land or when the owner dies and his son inherits it, they simply erase the name of the previous owner and write in the name of the new owner. And after about 4 or 5 generations, those names have been erased and there's no easy way to retrace or track who the owner is or what happened back 3 generations. So you have a French long lot system, you have a Spanish land grant system, then comes the English, who have the most complicated and undeveloped river system in the world. And so you have 3 different European land distribution systems. The English put great faith in the law. And so you turn to courts. And the court has to decide whose land is this. If you have 2 or 3 generations of people who maybe own a piece of land and they die, and the land is inherited by their offspring, then you have to have some kind of system by which you can resolve the differences, if there are some. If you sell half of it, what happens? You have to redraw new boundaries. So when the Americans, the English, and the American colonists come here, they have a 3rd European land distribution system. And these 3 all overlap. If you have an Englishman who comes in and acquires a Spanish land grant, whose law prevails? How do you decide how that land is going to be transferred? How is it going to be distributed? If there's no survivor to the family, how does that land get distributed? So you have 3 overlapping European land distribution systems, all set on a Native American land distribution system. And Native Americans saw land to be used. And they said, no one can own land. The land is not to be owned. It doesn't belong to people. The land is there and you use it. Thomas Jefferson sought to resolve that by coming up with a land distribution system, the Land Ordinance of 1785. He's the father of that. And it creates precise land ownership. So he creates a range, a section, a township, a lot. And so you will know exactly where your land begins and ends. And you have overlapping land distribution systems. The courts are full of cases of people fighting over land. Finally, in 1832, the United States Supreme Court said, we don't understand any of this. We don't know how we're going to resolve these issues, so you people decide out in the communities. So they pass it back to local communities, to states and communities, and they say, work it out there. We can't understand all this. And so Americans are often, in the 19th century, caught up in land ownership, squabbles and fights and debates. People died fighting over pieces of land. Abraham Lincoln's father had, I think, a dozen farms that he lost that were taken from him. So Americans have fought over land constantly, and the courts are full of cases involving land. So you could never get a clear title to your land. You were never certain that you're going to be able to hold on to that land. Interesting dimension of American history. One of the important people in Cape Girardeau history is Louis Lorimer. Lorimer is a Frenchman with a very, very unusual background. Born in Montreal, he was known as Lormier Louis as a Frenchman. He moved to the Ohio Valley where he became Lormy, and he ended up in Cape Girardeau where he's called Lorimer. And Louis Lorimer, of course, was the founder of Cape Girardeau. We celebrate him here in many ways. We have Old Lorimer Cemetery, New Lorimer Cemetery. We have the name Lorimer in a variety of places within this community. He's important to Cape Girardeau. He's important to the River Valley. And he is significant because he traveled throughout the Ohio Valley in the late 1700s and early 1800s. He's a very significant individual on the American frontier, and he is a Cape Girardeau person. He and his wife are buried in Old Lorimer Cemetery system. He's an interesting fellow because he was at one time a citizen of France, a citizen of Spain, and then a citizen of the United States of America. In the meantime, he also lived in English territory in the Ohio Valley. So he is significant in a way of telling the transition of the Ohio Valley from its early origins to its American presence. Lorimer is a significant individual. If you look at a map that we have here, you can see that he was throughout the Mississippi Valley. He lived in Vincennes, he lived on Apple Creek, and just north of Cape Girardeau. He was in Ohio. He was in Champaign County, Ohio, and then moved eventually to Illinois. In the Red House, we have a panel that illustrates an artist's concept of Louis Lorimer. Everyone described him as having a queue of hair that came down his back and to his knees. And he could use that queue of hair almost as a whip to sort of tap his horse, make him move. He is a dramatic individual in physical appearance. He's on the frontier. Everybody thought he was, described him as very small, very wiry, very tough, and an individual who reflects much of the American frontier in the 1700s and 1800s. He died in 1812. He was the commandant, Spanish appointed in 1802, and when the United States acquired this territory in 1803 as part of the Louisiana Purchase, Louis Lorimer became an official of Cape Girardeau, and he became the commandant here, and in America, he became involved in the land distribution system. And he had several children, all of whom acquired the land. He had 6,002 acres of what is now Cape Girardeau. So he is a very great landowner, and his children all inherited that. So if you married into Lorimer's family, you became a prominent individual in the community. Lorimer is a big name in America and a big name in Cape Girardeau. One of the most interesting illustrations we have in the Red House is this panel about rivers, roads, and transportation. It talks about the highways. It describes the roads as they developed. Most of the highways were on the rivers. No one built roads. There are paths. There are Indian trails, the Natchitoches Trail, for instance, the Edwards Trace, Three Knots Road, and the King's Highway. There are roads that were maybe first made by buffalo or bison, then by Indians who followed, and then by Americans who came in. They had to use the river and all of the boats that would carry them and their cargo. So you have flatboats, pirogues, ferries, keelboats, all making a very rich river heritage. And if you come and take a look at this panel, it will illustrate the evolution of transportation from walking trails to paths that were paved and developed into actual roads. And you have all of the macadamized highways, more macadamized miles of highway in Cape Girardeau County than in any county in the state of Missouri at the time of statehood and in 1850. So you do have the effort to pave roads with stones from large to small and then a top on it. So it's macadamized. And if you put a bit of tar or oil on top of that macadamized road, it becomes tarmac. So it's really a paved highway. They were moving in that direction throughout the 19th century. And if you could get that developed and eventually move to railroads, you could connect for trade and commerce throughout the nation. We are a nation of roads, a nation of highways, a nation of rivers. We want to go someplace. That's been an American desire. The automobile made it a craze. We want to go someplace. And advertisers realize that. But here we have illustrations of rivers, of trails, of roads, all important to the existence of people who live on the frontier. Americans always have a problem with storage. We have too much of everything. That was true also on the frontier. They built houses, but you could not afford to build big houses. It was very difficult, very expensive, so houses were often too small for the contents. Consequently, everyone who built a house wanted a storage space of some kind, and many people built an attic. We built an attic here in the Red House because we knew Louis Lorimer was a trader. He was a fur buyer, so he had to have a storage place for furs inside out of the weather. Consequently, they built an attic here, and when we built it and when we moved into it in the first winter, we discovered, my gosh, it's cold here in this house. We had no barrier between downstairs and upstairs. So we put in an acrylic shelf so that the heat here in the house below stays here, keeps us warm, lets that get cold. We have the ability now to turn the lights off and take a look at the structure and the architecture. We now use this room to show or illustrate what we have done to maintain this house. And we have followed the model of houses of this style in St. Genevieve. So we think this is authentic as we can make it, as they would have been in 1801, 1803, 1806.
Whenever you're ready.
One of the important artifacts that we have here is a cannon, replica of a cannon that was used on the Corps of Discovery by Lewis and Clark in 1803. This cannon, this replica, is donated by the Bear Track Trading Post of Anna, Illinois. Everett and Jody Ryan, proprietors, dedicated on August 30, 2005. This is a replica of a gun similar to the one mounted on the bow of the Corps of Discovery vessel. It has a 1 3/8-inch bore and was designed as a close quarters weapon. It could be loaded with anything that could be used as shot, scrap metal, to rocks. Lewis and Clark left the cannon at the Mandan village after their winter encampment. One of the great days in Cape Girardeau history was November 23, 2003. That's the day we celebrated the completion of this red house. And in 2000, the year 2000, the state of Missouri organized a Lewis and Clark Commission to celebrate, figure out how is the state of Missouri going to celebrate Lewis and Clark's venture west from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean and back. What will we do? How will we celebrate? So the governor appointed a commission, number of people from different agencies, all of whom had a history interest. One day I got a call from Shannon Cave, member of the Missouri Department of Conservation. He was on the Lewis and Clark Commission, and he said he wanted us to do something in Cape Girardeau that would commemorate Lewis and Clark. And he wanted us to build something, do something that would survive 2003, that would go beyond the celebration. And in a day or two, I had a call from Mark Cross of the Missouri Department of Transportation. He repeated the same thing. So I had two people that I knew who called and said, can you organize a meeting and see if you can get some people who would be interested in participating in a Cape Girardeau a red house or commission of some kind that commemorates Lewis and Clark. And so we put an ad in the local paper, the Southeast Missourian, and lo and behold, we had a meeting that evening, the date that we set, and we had a number of people who showed up. Some of them included Linda Nash, who was a history teacher in Jackson High School, who was working on a book, Her Magnificent Obsession, she said, about Lewis Lorimer. We also had Jane Randall Jackson, a person of great ability and great energy, who showed up. And so we had enough people with passion, with dedication, that we knew we could do something. What we could do, we talked about, and we ended up deciding we wanted to build something that would go beyond 2003, that would last, that would tell the story of Lewis and Clark, the original voyage and the reenactment voyage. And as a result, we had the building of this structure done entirely by volunteers, a little bit of help from some professionals, but for the most part by volunteers. Brian Allworth, the weatherman on KFVS, came and worked here. We had lots of people. We had maybe as many as 100 people who worked on this building. And we built this structure from the ground up with volunteers. And we finished it in time for the reenactment in 2003. And so we have some photographs here, and if you come to the Red House, as I hope you will, you have the celebration that we had. We had a huge crowd, more than 2,000 people showed up. It was a great event. It was interesting, it was fun, it was exciting, in fact, thrilling to see this come together. So this house was finished, ready for the reenactment, and we had a huge crowd to celebrate and commemorate this event. And so the photographs here, including pictures of the Newfoundland dog. Lewis and Clark had a Newfoundland dog that they bought for just a few dollars, and he went all the way to the Pacific coast and all the way back. So he made the whole trip. The reenactment dog that they got in Louisville for a small amount of money didn't make it. He died just up the Missouri River, a short distance from St. Louis. But they did get another Newfoundland dog, and he made the trip all the way back to Cape Girardeau. But here are pictures, illustrations of the excitement, of the fun, of history, commemorating Lewis and Clark's venture on the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast. And all of the individuals who made that trip came back to Cape Girardeau. Here is an illustration of their return, and below is Lewis and Clark celebrate Lorimer after 200 years. So this is an example of the crowds of the different people. We had prominent individuals from across the state and across the Midwest who came to Cape Girardeau to see the reenactment and to see the Red House and to dedicate the Red House. It's an act, a work of achievement that will last for a long time. We hope forever, and will celebrate the 200 years of Lewis and Clark coming to Cape Girardeau and going to the West Coast. All that symbolizes, all that puts into perspective is a story of American history prominent in the Mississippi Valley and centered in Cape Girardeau. So it's an important part of our history now. It's an important part of Cape Girardeau. And the Red House continues to educate, continues to illustrate, continues to document what happened here 200 years ago and reenacted in 2003.